right, I want to thank everyone for joining our next session of Intro to Watercolor with Ruthe Guerry, Creative Engagement Manager for Mather Community Initiatives. Ruthe is an art therapist and practicing artist. She weaves her personal experience as an herbalist, meditator, and maker into programs that focus on whole person wellness. We also have the great fortune of having Laura Weil join us today. Laura is a program assistant at Mather. She'll be helping us answer some questions in the chat, so do keep your eyes out for her name. In this series, Ruthe is covering basic watercolor techniques and the mindfulness benefits of mark making and working with watercolors. You don't need any experience to participate. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ruthe to take us away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Deidre. And welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today. Watercolor is one of my favorite processes, and it's because it feels good. It can feel a little intimidating because you can't erase it, you can't paint over it. There's so many like seemingly downsides to watercolor, but the truth is, this is an incredibly meditative process. It forces us to slow down because you're literally waiting for water to dry. And slowing down is so nice because it kind of puts us in a place of rest. Life gets busy and chaotic, and so taking moments to kind of push paint around paper can feel really good. So whether you are brand new to watercolor or this is something that you've done before, hopefully this is kind of a fun, enjoyable learning experience for you. We'll start off. I just want to kind of talk a little bit about where we've been to kind of build up on our process, what we're starting today. So we started our series just a couple weeks ago, focusing on the different supplies. Let's see if we can spotlight my hands really quickly. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So we started off talking about some of the different supplies that are out there. It can feel really intimidating when you go into an art supply store or even a big box store and you see all the different brushes and pigments and papers out there. It's hard to know what do you use for what? When do you use it? So we spent some time starting off talking about some of the different supplies out there and how we can use them. We spent a little time also talking about a little bit about color theory. We created our own color wheel. We talked of different ways of blending and mixing, and we'll kind of go through that again with what we're painting. But we talked about primary, secondary, tertiary colors. We talked about complementary colors and how those complementary colors can really, and I'm going to move to this paper here, talked about how those complementary colors can help give us more natural shadows. And so the example was thinking about a red apple using green as that complementary color to give that natural shadow, or a yellow lemon using purple as a way to get that natural looking shadow. So we talked a little bit about color theory. And then last week, we actually started our conversation on different techniques. Now, these techniques that we're going over are not ones that you have to know the title of. You don't have to remember all of them. But the main thing about going over some of these different techniques is talking about, or just illustrating rather, that there are so many different ways to use watercolor. And so we started off by talking about a flat wash, which is that flat wash of color, that flat plane of color. This is a wet brush on a dry surface, right? And so there's no variation in color. Then we talked about wet on wet, which is another technique, right? That's a wet brush on wet paper. And this has quite a variance in color here. You can see some color blending. You can see darker areas and softer areas. It's less control over the color because the water is kind of taking that around. We talked about glazing, which is a flat wash of color, and then another flat wash of color on top of it. And you can see how even using the same color, these are the same reds, when we paint one layer on top of another layer, it's a way of kind of darkening that color, making it a little more rich. You can also do it with different colors, and we can see that with the green flat wash that we laid on top of a red flat wash. So you have their green, and it kind of mixes with that red, right? And it's not that we're mixing pigments, but it's that we're taking one layer and painting it on top of another. Excuse me. So that's glazing. Then the graduated wash is kind of a graduated color, right? An ombre effect almost. You have that dark color with that smooth transition into the lighter color. We have feathering, which is the same as the graduated wash. You have that darker area of color that gradually blends into a lighter area. And then we have like scumbling. Scumbling is that flat wash, but we use things like a brush or a sponge to create texture. Another way to do that is by using a dry brush, which is a mostly dry brush on a dry surface. And this is something that you can do. Both of these we'll kind of talk about today, but these focus on today. But these are wonderful techniques when you're doing things that require texture, things like doing leaves on a tree, grass in a field, bark, the spots on a stone, or doing a transition in egg color if you're painting like an egg and nest. These are some really great techniques to get that textured look. And like I said, it's done with a brush or a sponge. There are a couple ways to do it. And then the last one we talked about last week was lifting. And lifting is something that you can do on a wet surface or on a dry surface. That lifting was a flat wash of color that we did here, but to lift, we took a dry brush and picked up some of that wet pigment. And if your pigment is dry, you can take a wet brush and lift up some of the dry pigment. So there are a couple ways to do that. And so these are some of the basic techniques. We're going to utilize a lot of these in our painting today. But before we kind of jump into the painting, I wanted to go over, there are 3 other techniques that are really helpful, and these are additives. And so I wanted to kind of go over these today before we jumped into our watercolor painting. Now, as always, I'm going to walk through our supplies, but the truth is whatever watercolor supply you have with you is good. You can use that today and you can be successful with it. The main thing we need for today is our paper, and I'm using watercolor paper. But just as a reminder, the thicker the paper, the more sturdy it is, the better it holds up to water. We'll also need our pigment. You can use a pan palette that comes with the paint already in it, or you can create your own palette like I have here where I use tubes of watercolor to create my own. I'll be demoing with both so we can kind of see how both of them work well. We also need brushes today. So I have 2 different brushes. We talked about a lot of brushes that you can use in watercolor, but the 2 most versatile brushes are going to be a round brush and a flat brush. So if you have a pan palette, typically the brushes that come in there are going to be a round brush or a small flat brush. And both of those work. I'll be demoing those. I'll also be demoing with a bigger round brush and a bigger flat brush that I bought separately. I'll be doing all of these again so we can kind of see that you can get a wide variety of things with very basic supplies. And then of course we'll need our 2 cups of water, one for cleaning our brush and one for adding clean water to our paper and our palette, and then a rag or paper towel. So these are kind of our basic supplies. Now, when we talk about additives, I'm going to bring in a couple other things. So on the handout, one of the handouts you'll see, let me go back to the watercolor technique handout, you'll see at the bottom there's additives. And there are 3 that can be a lot of fun to work with and you can use in a variety of ways. One is salt, and this is regular table salt that you use for your food. The other is shavings, and that's using your watercolor pencil. And then the last one is masking or resist. And so those are the ones that I want to kind of talk about today really quickly. So before we start doing any painting, let's go ahead and activate our watercolors. And just as a reminder, the way we activate our watercolors is by either spraying a little water on top or by taking your brush and dipping your brush in water and then bringing that water to your palette. You can also use a dropper. But what we want to do is go ahead and activate our watercolor. And we're going to be letting that sit for just a moment. And the reason we want to activate our watercolor before we start painting is that that pigment is dry and it needs water. If we right away started using that pigment on our paper, we would get some color, some nice color. But we get even better color, even more bold and brighter color when we add that water and let it sit for a minute to loosen up that pigment. So we're activating that watercolor, and I'm going to come over here while that's sitting for a moment and start talking about some of the additives. So the first one I want to kind of mention is masking. Now, masking is something you can do in a couple ways. Masking is all about a resist. And so two of, I think, the more common resists out there are things like a wax crayon. I have just white here. And the other is masking fluid. There are a couple different types of masking fluid. There's one that is permanent masking fluid. That one you paint it on and it stays. But this masking fluid is a masking fluid that you can peel off. So let's talk about a couple ways to use that masking, right? So the first is by taking a wax crayon. And just for the purpose of today, I'm just going to add a little mark with it. I know it's hard to see white on white, but I'm just going to add kind of a spot of the wax crayon. And then I'm going to take my brush and add a little bit of this masking fluid. And this masking fluid, we can just kind of paint on top. You see, I'm just kind of doing a layer. Right. So the masking fluid, like I said, there are a couple brands that are really good. You can get one that's like, it'll say art masking fluid. I think a really common one is Misket. It's kind of like a frisket, I guess. But anyway, both of these are really great types of wax resists or watercolor resists, sorry. And so what you do is you'll take some of this on a brush and you'll paint it. The reason this is so helpful is that it helps keep the white paper white. So if you're doing a landscape, let's say, and you want to make sure you leave some white in the sky when you add blue, you can take this masking fluid and paint on there everywhere you want to stay white. And once that dries, you can paint your watercolor on top of it. And when you're done with your painting, you can go through and peel up this masking fluid. Now, when you're using something like a wax crayon, like I just did in the wax crayon, that you won't be able to pull up. But if you use white, it's not going to be seen on the white paper. And so again, that's another way to kind of keep the white white. We're going to wait a minute and let that dry. And I'm going to hop down to the shaving. Now, shaving can be a really fun process. Shaving involves watercolor pencils. So we mentioned a couple weeks ago that this is a really great supply to have watercolor pencils. You can use watercolor pencils in a couple of ways. My favorite way to use watercolor pencils is to do the there we go. To use it as kind of like a starting point to kind of map out my drawing. Watercolor pencils are really nice because they are water soluble. So when you add water to it, that pigment from the pencil blends in with the watercolor and you don't see that line anymore, which is really nice. And I'll show how to use that in a little bit actually. But you can also use watercolor pencils by dipping it in some water and then drawing, or by drawing, coloring it in, and then adding just plain water to it, and it'll be that kind of watercolor looking painting. Like I said, my favorite way to use this is like the beginning of a drawing, and I'll show how to do that in a moment. But to do shaving, what I'm going to do is take my round brush, and I'm going to start off by painting with water first. Just real quick, add a little water. And then I'm going to come over with my wet brush. And I'm going to do the red again, but I'm going to get some red on my brush and just kind of paint on here. Add a little bit of color. So I'm doing a wet on wet, wet paper, wet brush. And then I'm cleaning my brush, tapping it on my towel just to make sure I get most of the water out, and then laying it flat, right? Making sure it's clean. Now, when we add the shaving, this is really good if you're doing, again, like the speckles on an egg, or light speckles that you find on a stone, or speckles like if you're painting sand. This is a really great way to do it. So what I'm going to do is actually take my green here. And you may have noticed sometimes, if you're looking at drawing supplies, you may notice there's like a little block of sandpaper. You can also use regular sandpaper that you find in the hardware store. But what you can do is take your watercolor pencil and just kind of scratch it across that sandpaper, and you can see that shaving falls. One of the nice things is that because the pencil is water soluble, you can see it start to dissolve in that water. Now, when you do this kind of technique to add that kind of speckled look, you want to make sure that that paint is still wet. If it's dry, you won't get that kind of speckly look, but if it's wet, you can use it, right? The color kind of blends in. So we can see it already starting to kind of blend out. We've got some nice speckly happening here and some little bits of like confetti glittery type stuff over there too. This one is a really fun technique to play around with. And like I said, it's good if you're doing natural things. If you're doing something like freckles on a face, or like I said, doing like different colored sand or colors on a rock. You can layer this up too, so we could do several layers. I'm just doing red and green, so it's a little easier to see it on camera, but you can play around with shaving several different colors of your pencil, or have several different colors in your background color. So again, we can kind of see how that water is taking that pigment and blending it. It's just kind of a fun technique to have in your back pocket. Another one that I absolutely love, and this is the type of painting I do most often because it feels good to me, is using salt. So salt, and I'm just going to kind of walk through this too, is just taking your brush, getting it wet, painting with water first. So I'm just painting a little square. And then I'm going to again go to the red and just kind of add. We're just tapping. You can see that color is starting to blend. The water is taking that color out. I'm going to clean my brush, tap it on here. And so we can see that water is starting to pull that pigment out. This is that wet on wet, right? If we wanted to do something like salt, what I love about salt is that it changes this texture. It gives it a fun crystallized look. And so I'm using just regular table salt and shaking it on top. And you can already see that that salt is soaking up the water and leaving the pigment there. And so you're getting this really, really nice kind of crystallized look. I'm going to move this out of the way really quick and come up a little closer so we can see how that's looking. Okay. So we can see that salt is starting to pull that water. So you're getting some really nice designs in that paint. This one feels so good to do because again, that water, that wet brush on wet paper gives you a really nice meditative kind of look and process. And then when you add things like salt or shaving, you can watch how that blends out, how the water takes it, and it just kind of feels good. Again, this is another process, like technique to save in your back pocket. All right, so I'm going to come back up here to the masking fluid. So here we did a little bit of that masking fluid. We also did a wax crayon, a wet wax crayon. So what I'm going to do is get my brush wet, tap it, and then come over here to that red and just kind of paint across. Okay. Right. So what we're seeing right now is, of course, like coverage, right? We just see the red. The truth is, you can start to see as this is kind of drying out a little bit, you can see that where that wax crayon is, it's not lasting. That wax crayon is kind of pushing that water and pigment off. And then over here where that frisk or the masking fluid is, that's resting on top of it. But once this dries, we can scrape that off, just kind of rub that masking fluid off, and you have that white underneath, right? So here again, we can see that that pigment is not sticking to this surface. That wax crayon is causing that pigment to kind of pull, right? And then I'm just going to, for the sake of time, press into this so we can go ahead and pull it off. So that water is staying on top, and you just roll your finger across and it picks up that little bit of masking fluid. You can peel that off, right? By just rolling your finger, and then you have that white surface underneath. So those are some really additive techniques, adding that masking fluid or that wax resist, adding shaving, and adding salt. So that kind of finishes off our techniques. This is, again, not something that you have to know. You don't have to know these words. But the main reason for going over these different techniques is so we know that there's so many different ways that we can take this, right? We can use our brush, our basic brush, and I used red each time, but you can see I've got so many different patterns and textures and variations in color this way. So I'm going to move this out of the way and let's start talking about using these techniques. All right. So one of the handouts that are in the chat is this one right here on bark, leaves, and grasses. So we're going to kind of start our watercolor painting here by talking about bringing some of those techniques in and doing some painting with these different reference pictures. So as we're kind of doing this painting, if you have your paper with you or your watercolor, go ahead and activate your watercolor. We're going to start trying out some of these different techniques to create some of these looks. Yep. So the first thing I want to mention is going ahead and prepping your paper. So anytime you're getting ready to do a watercolor, it's always good to get your paper ready. I like taping my paper down because it holds it in one place and keeps it still for me. And when I'm doing something like an actual painting, I'll tape down 3 sides on the edge. And then for the last side, I'll come in just a little bit. Get the dog hair out of the way. Come in just a little bit. So I have a page over here that's the same paper as what I'll paint on. I have this paper over here that I can use to create my swatches. And just as a reminder, we talked about creating swatches whenever we're doing a painting, because if we're mixing colors, we want to know what that color is so we can go back to that color and continue painting. And so it's important to have that swatch. Now you can have it on the same paper like I have mine, or you can have it on a separate piece of paper, but you want to make sure that that paper is the same type of paper that you're painting on. Different papers can be different colors, different brands can be different colors, and so you want to make sure that everything is kind of the same. So to start off, I'm going to talk just a little bit. I'm going to come back to this handout here and talk a little bit about some tips, and then we're going to jump into our reference pictures here. So when it comes to any type of painting, any type of drawing, even when you're making something in your own mind, making it up completely from imagination, it's very important to still observe, right? And so when it comes to painting something like a tree, we're going to focus on tree today. But when it comes to painting something like a tree, even if I'm making up my own tree, there are some things that I want to like think about, right? And a lot of it has to do observation. Observation is the perfect first step when it comes to any type of painting or drawing. So if I'm drawing a tree, even if I'm making it up, I want to take a look at an actual tree in space, right? In its own space and environment, because that's going to help me kind of paint my own, right? The first thing we want to kind of think about when it comes to like observing is notice the colors, right? We want to notice the colors. We want to notice the shapes, the lines, the light. All these things are really important. So let's kind of break it up into smaller pieces here. So if we're looking at our image here, and I should have your handout too if you want to kind of download that, should be in the chat. But this picture is just a regular tree, right? If we look at it, I'm just going to point out some of the things that are helpful to observe. So when we start making our own painting, we can kind of pull some of those things in to create a natural looking tree, right? So the first thing that I'm noticing when I look at this is that some of the sides are lighter than the other side, right? So this side has a lighter green than this side has. So what that tells me is that the light is on this side and it's going this direction. This is the lightest part here. And so when we're doing like painting or drawing, we know that the lightest part is going to be the complete opposite of the darkest point. And the darkest point is the absence of light, right? So we see the lightest point here and we see the darkest point here, right? And we can even notice that with the tree here. We see the lightest bark, the lightest color here on the right side, and then that darker color on the other side. So what that tells me, again, is that the light is coming from the right and going to the left. What we'll also notice when we're looking here is that we'll see that um, we don't really see individual leaves, right? We know that those are individual leaves. It's not one leaf. It's an individual leaf, but we don't see the individual leaves. We kind of see an illusion of individual leaves. And that's one good thing to keep in mind too. When we're painting tree, when we're painting grass, we don't have to draw every individual like blade of grass or every individual leaf because that gets too busy. That's too much information. So giving that kind of illusion of leaves, right? An illusion of a lot of leaves is a great way to kind of translate that image, right? And also kind of helps us breathe a little easier too, right? We don't have to do like 10 million leaves. We can do this kind of bush, right? So we can see also that in each of these sections, it looks like there's light on top and then dark underneath it. So what that tells me is that this is not a rounded shape, right? This tree has a lot of shape to it, right? It's and even stuff that's like rounded shapes, kind of like one of these trees are, you can still see that there are dark parts in different areas of those leaves. Just like here, there's a dark part here, a darker part here, a darker part here, and the lighter parts on top, right? So that tells me that I have more of a organic shape than just one round shape. I also want to point out one of the things that I'm noticing too is that it's not solid green, right? I can see that there are bits of the sky behind it, right? We don't see just one plain like flat wash. We see lots of details, right? But there's gaps where I can see through the tree. So what that tells me is that I'm not going to be painting flat washes of color for here. I'm going to be painting areas of color so I can still see the sky underneath. Hmm. And then I also noticed, like, even though this is green, there's several different shades of green in this, right? And the same when we look at bark too. I was telling someone just recently, I have a giant box of reference photos and images that I've collected from different photos I've taken or magazines that I've looked at that help me when it comes to painting a landscape. Even if it's a landscape from my imagination, I'll pull out a reference photo just to help me kind of figure out color and kind of get me in that mindset of what I'm painting, right? And so here are some of the bark images that I look at. And so I want to just like take a moment to look at the bark. We think of tree bark as being brown, but one of the things that you'll notice if you're really looking in it at these images, you'll notice that here we've got pink, we have purple, we have yellow, we have red. We also have the gray and brown in there. If we look at this one, we see there's more pinks and oranges in this bark. Right. So there's lots of layers of color inside these images here. If we're looking at just the bark, we can see it's not, again, not a solid wash of color. It's a wide variety of color that's in there. And we can also see, if we're looking at this one specifically, we can see that the light is hitting some of it, but we have moments of shadow in here where it's darker. So it's important to notice those details, to observe those details. So when we start painting, it kind of guides us in how to lay out our drawing and how to kind of build it up, right? So I'm going to kind of set this just to the side a little bit, and let's talk a little bit about painting. So when it comes to like drawing your image, when it comes to creating your painting, I shared earlier one of my favorite ways to use watercolor pencils is to kind of do that layout, figure out spacing and what I want to include in my drawing here. So let's say I want to do a tree here. And if you have your watercolor and paper, definitely follow along. I'm going to take my watercolor pencil here and I'm using a brown, right? You can use a regular number 2 pencil to kind of lay out your drawing, but when you're using a regular pencil, number 2 pencil, you'll need to erase it before you add the color. And that's because our regular number 2 pencil is not water soluble, so it stays there. If we use something like a watercolor pencil to do that underlying drawing, that is water soluble, and so when water hits it, it blends in, okay? So I'm going to take my brown watercolor pencil and just really quickly kind of do just a basic tree shape. So very boring tree. So I've got my watercolor pencil here. I've drawn kind of the basic trunk of my tree, right? And I've drawn a little branch coming up, right? You can see it's kind of dark, but like I said, the good thing is when we start adding color to it, we add that water to it, it'll blend in. So I can kind of, I don't have that showing, right? It gives me kind of a guideline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by taking my round brush, and whatever brush you have is good. But I'm going to start off by doing kind of a wash of color. Okay? So I'm going to take my brush and get it wet. And when it comes to painting, watercolor, anything, a good rule of thumb is to start with your lightest color first and build it up to your darkest color. So let's say if I'm doing this bark right here, and I'm doing the lightest color first, I'm going to notice there's like a pale pink in there that seems to be the lightest color. Now, when we think about trees, we don't usually think about pink bark, but that's that lightest color that I'm noticing in that shape, right? You may see some like mustardy yellow, but that pale pink is a really pale, pale, pale light color. So that's the color that I want to kind of start with here. So I'm going to take my brush, and you can actually mix colors to get your different colors for your painting. I'm a big fan of mixing colors. I think that's important. You can mix your colors on the palette that your pigment is in, or if you have an extra palette like this, you can bring that in and use it to mix colors too. I like this one because when it dries, I can just rehydrate it and keep using that same color. But what I'm going to do is take my brush and get some clear water, clean water, and just add a little bit of water to one of those. I'm going to get my pale pink color, kind of a rosy pink color. So I've got a little water here. I'm going to get my brush wet, tap it, and then come over. I'm going to use a little bit of red to kind of mix it in there. I'm going to clean my brush before I get another color. And I'm going to use just a tiny bit of yellow. So I'm going to use this yellow here. So I'm going to get my wet brush in yellow, tiny bit of yellow, and add it here. Now it looks kind of dark, the color that I've mixed. It's mostly water. I used a tiny bit of pigment, a tiny bit of the red and a tiny bit of the yellow, tiny, tiny bit. So we've got this really pale color. Now it looks pretty dark while it's wet, but this is the benefit of having that swatch paper so I can test the color, right? So what I'm going to do is clean my brush, tap it, make sure I don't have any color on it, make sure I'm controlling the water. So I'm dipping it in the wet water or the clean water, tapping it a little bit, and then coming over here, and I'm just going to test it, making a mark. So we can see that little mark is much more pale than it is altogether, right? So this is a good color for that background. So I'm going to take my brush, come over to what I've mixed, and start adding it to my painting here, my drawing. You can see as I'm just painting, I'm getting my surface nice and wet, and I'm kind of following the drawing marks that I made. One of the things to keep in mind whenever we're doing a watercolor is to know that the water is only going to go, or the pigment is only going to go where the water is going. So when I'm doing my brush and painting it, you can see I'm running it against that brown mark that I did with my watercolor pencil, and you can see it's blending in, right? That little bit of water picks up that mark. And so when you're laying out your drawing, right? When we're laying out our drawing, we can sketch out the landscape. We can sketch out where we want the clouds to be. Doing those light pencil marks, we can blend that in. So you can see it's just kind of picking up that pigment when I add that water. I've got that light pale yellow as my first layer. Okay. Okay. So you can see that that pale layer is on there first, right? We've got that pale layer, and we're thinking about layering on top of it. When it comes to watercolor, it's all about layer, 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 layer. So we start with that lightest color and we gradually build up, right? So I'm going to come over here. If you're following along, definitely continue to do so, but I have a couple examples here that I want to kind of focus on. this tree shape that we've done. So once your piece dries, we'll pretend that this is the one I did and it's dry now. What I can do is come back with slightly darker colors. Now I want to keep in mind that the pigment is only going to go where the water is. So once this is dry, we want to start that second layer, right? So what we'll do is we'll make sure our brush is clean. We'll get some clear water. And this is why it's helpful to have 2 water cups, right? And I'm just going to paint. I'm mostly painting one side because here's what I'm thinking. Remember, we talked over here about how the light is coming from this direction. So this side of my tree is lighter than this side. So I'm bringing that over here too. I'm going to say that the sun, my light is over here. And so it's coming this direction. So my darkest side is going to be on the left. So I'm taking the clean water and just kind of adding a big brush mark down the side. And I'm also coming up here to where my branch is. Because the light is coming this direction, the light is hitting here. So that means that darker part is on top on the left side of that branch, right? So I'm adding just a little bit of water. This side is mostly dry. This side now has water on it. So what I can do is add another layer of this color that I mixed, right? And I can just kind of follow it down, right? It's using that wet on wet technique, right? I'm tapping it on the side. And so what we're already seeing is that side is still lighter and this side is gradually getting darker. We can add more color to it too, mostly wet. So if I want to come in and add, let's say, a little brown to my color here, mix those colors up, I can still come through and just kind of tap my brush on this side and it's giving me a darker like shadow, right? And I can just keep doing that. And it's building up that kind of bark look, right? We're gradually getting darker and darker. As this dries, you'll get an image that sort of looks like this. And you can see that wet on wet, because it's wet on wet, it dries in that variation, right? We can remember how this looked, right? Our wet and wet from our techniques. We have a variation in color. It's not one solid color. So when we do the bark, we're adding that again, right? So each time we add more, right? We're wanting to kind of add that a darker color. And I know it can feel a little intimidating adding the darker color because again, we can't pull back, right? It's hard to erase. We can do some lifting, right? By doing that dry brush, picking up that wet pigment, but it's hard to erase, right? It's easier to add that darker color on than it is to pull that darker color off. So we're just kind of adding those colors in, right? And I'm going to add a little more brown. And I'm going to remember that that bark had a lot of yellow in it when I was looking at that image. So I'm going to add some yellow to my color too. Okay. And just kind of build that up. Now I will say, when you're doing watercolor and you add a color here, oh my gosh, this is so much yellow. Trees aren't yellow like this. Well, it's because it's really dark while it's wet, but when it dries, you're going to get sort of more of a blending, right? So this has a lot of yellow and orange in it. It's building up this image that we've seen here, right? Once we have kind of the solid background that we want, we can start bringing in all those other colors to create that real texture. And to do that, if we keep adding those layers on here, we'll get to a point where we can start scumbling, right? And just as a reminder, that scumbling is taking a dry piece, right? And using a mostly dry brush or a sponge to create that kind of texture. So let's say I'm going to make a color really quickly, a darker purpley gray. And it's always good to mix colors. And you can do that, right? I'm going to add a little purple to it. I'm using my pan palette here. A little purple. And I'm going to add a little black. Or if you have like a Payne's gray, that works too. A little black goes a long way. And you can see that as I'm painting, as I'm testing colors, checking those colors, I'm cleaning my brush in between each color, cleaning my brush, tapping it to make sure it's clean, and then dipping it in the clean water. And this is giving me a little more control over how much water I'm carrying, because the lighter, like the more water we use, the lighter that pigment is, right? So I can test here again and see the color that I've got and tell if I want to add more. So it's all about blending and mixing, right? And then testing that color. Right? And then once you get a color that you like, right, you can start coming in with the sponge. Remember, we talked about that natural sponge that we can get that scumbling, or by taking a brush, and I'm going to use a little round brush that comes in a palette. We can take that and start making those marks. And scumbling, again, is like tapping a wet brush with pigment, tapping it on a dry surface. And this is creating some marks, right? We're building this up layer by layer. So it's giving us kind of the illusion of depth and range of color, right? We're thinking about still where that light is hitting. So most of those dark spaces are going to be, if we continue this, most of those dark spaces are going to be on the left side, right? And so as that dries, it's building up that, that bark, right? And then we'll keep doing those layers. Once this dries, I can go back through and do more, whether it's scumbling and tapping it with my brush, or using that sponge to kind of pick it up and press into it, right? So to do landscape, I'm going to come back to this image here. Right? This bark is a lot of fun to play with. You can do that scumbling, but another way to kind of add to bark, make it look more bark-like, is to think about the wet on wet technique, just using that completely. So that's about taking your surface, making sure it's completely wet where you're wanting that paint to be. And so I'm just kind of, again, just painting where my bark is, and then coming over and constantly adding pigment, right? And so as it dries, cleaning my brush every time, coming over, getting the pigment and tapping it. And that water is taking it and moving it, right? We're thinking about where the light is hitting. So we know we're getting that darker color in there, right? The light is coming. We want the darkest colors to be the furthest away from where the light is, right? And so as we're building this, you can see that water is taking that color and pulling it out. We can add in, some of that black, Payne's gray. And you can see that starting to kind of pull across, right? Blend in nicely. Now, I will say, it looks kind of intimidating when you put that darker color on there and you're like, oh no, that's too dark. But the truth is that water is pulling it. We can already see the black that I put here, that Payne's gray I put here, is starting to blend nicely. So it's not as dark as it is in those drier areas where I first put it. That water is pulling it out, right? So whether you're doing lots of layers like this to add up and build that bark, or you're going through and doing that scumbling where you're getting that kind of bark look, you can combine all those techniques, that scumbling technique and that wet on wet technique, even that dry brushing technique, to kind of get that. Right? So let's say, and just the little time that we have left today, let's say that we want to do grass. There is one. Let me get my green pencil here. So to do grass, if we're looking at a landscape, we're looking out, there's something that's called atmospheric perspective. And this is really important when it comes to painting like a landscape. Atmospheric perspective means that the closer something is, the more detail and color range that you see. The further away it is, the lighter, the more muted the color, and the less detail that you see. So we can see in this image here, and I'm going to pull it up closer. In this landscape here, we can see the lightest lights, the darkest darks. There's a lot of detail here. We can see all the marks of the grass. But as it goes further back into the field, it becomes this kind of plane of color, this wash of color. And then in the background, we can see that this is sort of leaves from a tree, but all the detail is up in this foreground here. So when we're laying out a landscape, when we're doing that painting, we want to kind of think about that too. Still do those washes of color, right? Building them up little bit by little bit, like we were doing with the bark. But we want to think about that gradual muting of colors the further back it goes. That's one trick to make something that's 2D look 3D. So I'm going to take my pencil here and just kind of, I'm drawing a landscape here. This is the paper for my landscape. So let's say I'm drawing my tree here, right? And then I've got my foreground, and then I've got like a background here. I'm thinking about the shape of my tree. This is just really quick because we're talking about flat washes. So I'm going to take this is a watercolor pencil that I use, but I'm going to start off thinking about, again, being reminded that the darker color is closer and that lighter color is further back. And so what we'll want to do is start with that lighter color and gradually build up to that darker color. So I'm using my light green. I'm going to get my brush wet. If I want to mix colors, that's great. But we'll start off by just kind of doing that flat wash of color. Everywhere I want that green to be, I'm just painting that light wash. And because it's a light wash, I'm going to do that all the way back, right? And you can see as I'm adding that water, it's picking up some of that pencil drawing, right? That watercolor pencil and blending it in with my painting, right? So even though I intentionally want this first part to be darker and more detailed, I'm doing a flat wash across the whole surface, right? And one of the things we'll want to do is add those layers, right? So when this layer dries, I can go in with a darker layer, right? And gradually get darker and darker. And when we get to those details, we can start bringing in some of those techniques. I'm going to pause right here for questions because I know we've got a lot of questions that are coming in, but we're going to come back to this next week. And I want to say, like, watercolor is a slow process, and we're just kind of starting that process today, right? We're going to create a landscape, but we're looking at those different elements before we kind of put it together. So definitely, I would definitely encourage playing around with the wet on wet and scumbling when it comes to bark, because that's a good technique to kind of be familiar with. And then start doing those plain washes of color for like the landscape, thinking about ground. So I can do clear wash, right? Get that same color and start getting a little darker here. And even though it's the same color, because we're layering it, it's going to start looking darker, right? So I'm going to pause right here if there are some questions that are coming up so far.
There are quite a few questions in the chat. I know we got to some of them, but I'll voice some of them out loud. Around masking, can you use a white birthday candle or other cleared hard wax?
Oh, yes. So definitely. The thing about wax, though, like I was using a wax crayon, and like wax crayons work, but the thing about using wax, like a wax candle or wax crayon, is that it doesn't come up when you're doing the watercolor. So you want to make sure it's clear or white or whatever color your paper is. And if you're doing that masking fluid, that will come off. Once it dries, you can rub it and peel it off. So yes, you can definitely use other waxes, but you want to keep the color of the wax in mind.
Great.
Good question.
And then on the salt technique, will the salt eventually dissolve, or what happens to the salt when you're done?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to come back to this one. This is my example of salt. You can see it's crystallized. Once the salt dries, your painting dries, what you can do is start brushing off that salt. And then you have this kind of pattern here that's kind of like that texture. It looks, I like how this looks. It's very galaxy-esque. But yeah, you can leave the salt on there or you can brush it off. I usually brush it off, but you need to make sure that the painting is dry completely before you do.
Right. And then someone was asking about the watercolor sander. What's the name of that if they do want to purchase it?
Yeah, sandpaper. It's a drawing sandpaper. You can use like regular sandpaper too, but it's the sandpaper that comes in like a drawing kit. You'll usually get like graphite with it. But I usually use just a regular piece of sandpaper that I get from like the hardware store or the home supply store. But it's the sandpaper, drawing sandpaper, I think is what it's called.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And then someone asked if we use a white crayon for masking, would you then consider that piece multimedia or mixed media?
Oh, that's a really great question. If you're using more than one medium, then yes, it's definitely a multimedia piece, for sure. Even if it's just like one other medium. I would say though, if it's all watercolor and you have like one space where or is like just a couple spaces where the wax is there, like crayon, then you can still call it watercolor. When you're doing a whole bunch of other materials, it is mixed media. But technically, if you use more than one medium, it's mixed media. Yeah.
Right. And then with wet on wet, how do you prevent the colors from blending together and giving you an undesired color?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, wet on wet, if you are going too quickly, you can get a really muddy color. If you're using too many colors with the wet on wet process, it can get really muddy. So, one thing that I do that kind of helps me keep colors distinct is when I'm doing that wet on wet process, I'll use maybe 3 colors at a time and then let it dry and then do another wash of water before adding other colors. And so what that does is that gives me like here, I used a yellow, a red, and a black here. And so I'm going to let that dry. And then I'm going to come back with another layer of water and do this technique again with some of the same colors. And that way it stops it from getting muddy because I'm using just a few colors. And I can still see that layer because we know that if the layer is dry, we can glaze on top of it by putting another layer. So it's using that wet on wet technique. And when it dries, we're glazing another layer on top.
So
Yeah,
we've got
and it just comes with time too. The more you kind of play around with that wet on wet process, the more you'll be familiar, I guess, with how the water blends it, and you'll learn from that. Every time you practice it, every time you try it, you learn information on how much water to use, or how much pigment to use, or how little pigment to use.
the Thelma's raised their hand. I'm going to ask you to unmute, Thelma, so you can ask your question.
Yes. On the right side, at least it's my right, of the tree, did you start off blending with a reddish color, or did I
I
misunderstand
did.
that?
I
So
did.
now, so was that just left that way? Because that's the way I did mine. So from
Yeah.
what I'm looking at on the screen where you have your grass in the background,
Mm.
yours, I don't see reddish in your tree bark
And this
at
one.
all.
Yeah, I didn't add red to the tree. I was talking about focusing more on the planes, like starting with that lighter layer wash and then
No,
gradually
I'm
adding
I'm
those
speaking
darker layers.
about earlier when you
Oh,
were
here.
doing working on the tree
Oh, yeah.
itself.
Yes.
On the
So
right side of it,
mhm.
did you
I
use some
started
red?
off. Yeah, I
Was it
did. I
red?
made that kind of
Mhm.
pale red where it was like
Uh-huh.
I mixed red with a little bit of yellow and got
Okay,
this
that's
really
the piece I
muted red
missed.
and did I did a flat wash of color first
Mhm.
and then came back in with darker colors once that dried.
Okay, that's the piece I missed
Yeah.
because mine was like almost not as red as a delicious apple, but it was still quite red. But you
Quite
did
red.
add the
Yeah.
yellow to blend it. That's the piece I missed. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
No problem. And I do want to say, speaking of the bark, just as a reminder, when we're doing like a watercolor, you want to start with that lightest color first. And that's where
Right.
observation comes in, where you can look and see, okay, the palest color, the lightest color that I have here is that pale red. And so I want
Mm-hmm.
that to be that first color. So I'm doing the wash with that color. And once that dries, I can start building up to the
Mm-hmm.
next lightest color and gradually get darker.
Okay, and that would have been the yellow.
Yes,
Correct.
ma'am.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you again.
Yeah, no problem. Good question.
Right. Got two more questions for you, Ruth, and then I'll answer everyone's questions about the handouts and recordings to make sure that everyone has that information. Been a couple of comments in the chat about using rubber cement for covering the paper. Is that something that you've done or would recommend?
Oh, that's a good question. So rubber cement, you can use that. But it doesn't come off as easily as masking fluid does. So it does kind of block the surface, so you have that white there. And sometimes you can pull it up like with a kneaded eraser. You can like rub it with a kneaded eraser, and sometimes that pulls off the rubber cement. But it's harder to get that up. Masking fluid or like a wax resist like helps. And I will say when I'm doing a landscape, let's say I'm going to use my orange pencil here, but if I'm doing a landscape like this and I know I want areas that are white, I'll have my like watercolor pencil. I'll be like, okay, so I want this area to be white. So I'm just going to do a light drawing here. So I know not to add water to that area. So that's another way to do it too. That's where those watercolor pencils do come in handy because it can help you block off and plan how you want your piece to look too. So it's another way to kind of help keep the white part white.
Wonderful. And then another question, what's the best way to clean paint from a drawing board?
Oh, that's a good question. So I typically don't clean it. I'll wipe it off so I don't have any like paint on top of paint on top of what paint, because once you start getting that buildup, it affects your drawing. But usually what I'll do, or your painting, what I'll do, you can see with this one is I just wipe it off because it kind of soaks in the board. And so this way it's smooth to touch, and it's not going to transfer. Yeah. So you can clean it if you want. But the truth is, as long as it's wiped down, so it's like a smooth surface, it's going to be good.
Wonderful. And then I'm going to sneak one more in here. And I saw Laura did answer in the chat, but where can people find other of your classes?
Oh, hey, great question. So we have a lot of our, with Mather, we have a lot of our creative art programming on our YouTube channel. It's Mather Creative Community. We have a couple intro series, like Watercolor. We have Intro to Drawing, Intro to Pastels, Intro to Color Pencil, but we have art journaling and paper cutting and a lot of fun different types of processes and projects there too. So definitely, if you're interested in more, check out Mather Creative Community on YouTube and you'll see those videos there. And then come back next week too. We'll talk more about building that landscape and going into some sky, creating skies.
Perfect. And Laura put the link to Mather's YouTube channel in the chat, so take a look there for that. And then to answer other questions, Senior Planet will continue to bring Mather back for other programming. We know you all have been really enjoying this series, as well as the art journaling series that we did a couple of months ago. So these programs will continue to happen. We are posting them on our YouTube right now. Only session 1 is up, so I know it takes us a little while to get them up there, but I will put again the link to Senior Planet's YouTube channel in the chat, so where you can find that, as well as the handouts from today's session. So want to thank you, Ruthe, for a wonderful session. Thank you, Laura, for all of your help in the chat answering all these questions. It's been wonderful to see you all, and we hope you join us again next week to continue building our landscape.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Happy